friends, and thank you and welcome for joining us on part 2 of the Ultimate Money Formula series. In this series today, we will talk about inflation, which is the first and most important of the four in. And of course, we will talk about the opposite of inflation, which is deflation, which is something we also have to look at. But before we get into inflation itself, we must first look at the laws of demand and supply. I don't know why economists refer to this as laws, because these are not really law, unlike the laws of nature, laws of science, laws of logic and math. In fact, when it comes to supply and demand, there is a lot of elasticity with it. So, looking at demand first and foremost, of course, we are working on the first quadrant of a chart, meaning the vertical line, the y-axis, is the price, and the horizontal line, the x-axis, is quantity. Demand is the ability or willingness of buyers to pay for a certain product, good, or services, or a basket of these services as well. And this is usually taken not just per individual, but of course per society. The curve usually goes from the top left down to the bottom right with a slight curve towards the downside. And notice, of course, in my drawing, there is a right angle at the top left and at the bottom right. This is contradictory to what many economists say, but as I said, this is my opinion of the principles and not the law of supply and demand. For simplicity's sake, we will just make it a straight line from the top left diagonal down to the bottom right. This is demand. The willingness and or ability for buyers and consumers to pay for certain goods and products. On the other end of the spectrum, we have supply. Supply is the willingness of businessmen, suppliers, manufacturers, and sellers to sell goods and products at a certain price. The higher the price, the more willing they are to sell. Basically, that means the more profit they make, the more happier they are to sell that product. Of course, this is not, again, infallible, and there are a lot of elasticity to this. We draw this line on my principle with the right angle on the top right and the bottom left of the chart in the first quadrant, and this curves down towards the bottom from the top right to the left. This is my version of supply. However, for again simplicity's sake, we use just a plain straight line from the top right to the bottom left. This is supply. The willingness of sellers to sell compared to the profit that they make. However, these laws are not really laws. These are just guiding principles. Bear that in mind. It may not seem important now, but we will get back to this very often in the future. Meantime, where the cross occurs of supply and demand, this is known as equilibrium price, also known as free market value. We assume that there is no other force affecting the market value or the ability and desire of buyers and the ability and desire of sellers to sell certain commodities, products, goods, or services at the said price and with the said quantity. This equilibrium or free market value is an actual change of hands for the buyer and the seller, and it represents free market value because a certain amount of goods or services is given away by the seller for the price that the buyer has paid for. This, therefore, is the equilibrium price and quantity, as we can see. Anyway, going to inflation now. Now that we have learned the importance of supply and demand, inflation, everybody knows this as simply a price increase in goods and services. Definitely, inflation is defined as the lowering of value, the purchasing power of currencies. This lowering of value creates an increase in price of goods and services and a basket of goods and services. But what causes inflation? There are three basic causes of inflation. The first is built-in inflation. Built-in inflation happens simply because of growth in population and as time lapses. For example, when workers are in a factory for a long time, obviously their pay has to be increased. And as their salaries are increased, the owner of the factory increases his markup on products that he sells. This is built in inflation. The second inflation type is demand pull. Demand pull inflation, also known as lifestyle inflation, happens when individuals' incomes increases such that they end up buying more goods and services than they otherwise normally would. This increase in demand pushes the demand curve or the demand line towards the right. This obviously causes an increase in the prices of goods and services. Demand pull inflation is also known as good inflation because it means that people are earning more money than they otherwise would be in the past. This higher income is definitely most welcome. However, when people spend too much on goods and services, they create a demand pull inflation, not necessarily bad in itself, but in the population, it may cause problems for the third type of people involved. And the third type of people involved are those who suffer from cost push inflation. Cost push inflation happens mainly because there is demand pull inflation from some members of the society who thus increase prices, not knowingly or not wittingly, by simply buying more of the products and services simply because they have more income to spend. However, with this income to spend and the benefit for a few, the others suffer from cost push inflation because of the higher cost due to the higher demand of the few. Worse than that is we have another form of cost push inflation which occurs when certain goods and commodities increase in price for other reasons. For example, the biggest and best example I could give you is oil. When oil prices rise, this creates higher cost of production of electricity, higher cost of transportation, higher cost of manufacturing, and all these higher costs go down to the basic consumers who end up having to bear the burden of these higher costs. This is cost push inflation. This type of inflation is even more common than the demand pull inflation. Demand pull inflation only happens to a few people generally, and it happens only in good business or economic climates, whereas cost push inflation can happen almost all the time, anytime. Another thing to note is cost push inflation is always present in any given economy because of both built-in inflation, which is somewhat natural and inevitable, and cost push inflation also exists alongside with demand pull inflation. So cost push inflation is always present at any given time for a number of population or percentage of the population who suffer from its effects. Now that we've talked about inflation, let's talk also a little about deflation. Deflation happens similar to inflation, both in a good way and a bad way. A good inflation would be when deflation happens because of technological advances. Mainly, we can see this happening when cars in the 1990s got cheaper to produce thanks to the efforts of Henry Ford, or when computers became more of a household item thanks to the efforts from Apple and IBM. Technological advances creates deflation, in which case better efficiency is used in manufacturing or production of goods and services, which leads to lower prices and more quantity being provided to the public. The same thing happens when competition gets into business. Competition in business, provided it is fair, gives the public better quality products at lower prices. This is good deflation. However, there is also bad deflation, which happens when, in general, the public or a big member of the public simply cannot afford current market prices. Since they cannot afford the current market prices, they simply withdraw and take a burden on their quality of life by cutting down on these necessities sometimes, or even luxuries in other times. And this effect can cause the drop in the demand line as well as shift towards the left for the demand line. This shift in the demand line creates deflation or the lowering of prices. Usually, this is associated with the recession where the GDP has also been lowered very much or even in negative territory. However, if the GDP is still high and deflation is prevalent, this is a major warning sign of a dangerous shift in the fundamentals of a country's economy. Do bear this in mind and watch out for this. Bottom line, important part to take away here is that inflation is always present and inflation is our main enemy. Much more than deflation is prevalent. Inflation is always prevalent because it can happen even in good economy or in bad economy. Inflation, being the rise of cost of living, ties in with the first part of our formula, the cost of living and the quality of life. The only way to battle inflation is with making proper and correct investments. I did mention in part one of this series that many economists and politicians give false hopes to people of the lower income class by saying that our high GDP will eventually trickle down the ladder and benefit those of the lower income class. I also mentioned clearly that this was false and that this will never happen. Let me explain to you now why this will never happen. It is said that in most economies, including ours here in the Philippines, only about 5% of the population owns 90% of real estate or actual usable land. Also, this 5% of the population owns over 90% or close to 95% of big businesses. Therefore, when we see a high GDP number, it benefits this upper class in the population pyramid. As we can see, they enjoy the high GDP, more income, and they go through what we know as lifestyle inflation or they spend more. Those in the middle class may have also some boost in income, which is good, and they may also go through some form of lifestyle inflation. However, those in the lower income class are the ones who face cost push inflation. As you can see in our graph, every time somebody enjoys lifestyle inflation, they tend to push prices upwards by their activity, which is good, especially for them, but they tend to unwittingly, unknowingly create cost push inflation for those in the lower income classes. This is why the high GDP will never benefit those in the lower income classes, and only proper investments in education and work will benefit those of the lower income classes. Let us put together an example now, making use of a bucket with a faucet. The bucket is expandable and shrinkable. It never overflows, but it can always grow and it can always shrink. The faucet on top of the bucket represents your income, whether it's from salary or from profit in your business. And note that in the bucket, in the bottom part, there are multiple faucets leading money out of that bucket. That outgoing money is your cost of living, whether it's for necessities or luxuries. That money going out may be in housing space, whether it's rental or ownership of housing. Basically, you have to pay for your living space. You also need to pay for utilities, water, electricity, telephone, internet, so on. Of course, you need food, medicines, water, and whatnot. This outgoing water is subject to inflation. Even if your income remains the same, eventually time will catch up. Because of inflation, all the outgoing faucets will flow more water than what is flowing into the bucket. This will eventually drain out your bucket and cause it to shrink. The only way you can deal with this is by making wise investments to counter the effects of inflation. These outflowing faucets may be controlled. Of course, this is referred to as savings. The more you save, the better. However, as Robert Kiyosaki has pointed out, by the way, Robert Kiyosaki is the author of Rich Dad Poor Dad. As he has pointed out, saving money is good. However, it is more important to learn how to generate more money or more income. Therefore, the proper solution is to make good investments such that you can increase your income flow. In other words, the top faucet gets added or increases its flow into your bucket. Inflation is very important to look at, therefore, because even if you have 10,000 today, in several years' time, that 10,000 cannot buy you the same that it has bought for you today in terms of goods. In our next video, we will look at how to properly counter inflation, enjoy better quality of life, and counter the rising cost of living. This is all done by making wise and proper investments. Of course, we have to take risk into account, and we look at wise investments that really generate proper income. Join us again in the next video. I would like to remind you that if you have any questions anywhere along this series of videos, please post it on the comment below. I will get to your questions as soon as possible. Thank you and see you in the next one.